for this.
All right, thanks, Catherine. So I'm Jaakko, and for my summer internship, I worked with the City of Toronto conducting a survey of their hard surface street trees that were planted in 2022. So hard surface street trees are trees planted by the City of Toronto in hard surfaces like concrete sidewalks and hardscaped parks. They provide important ecosystem services to Toronto's public, especially, I think, like all urban trees do, but I think they're especially important for providing cooling in the hot summer months. They're often planted in areas with a lot of concrete and asphalt. They can get really hot in the summer, so they provide much needed shade to Toronto's pedestrians. But unfortunately, these trees struggle with difficult growing conditions. They're often planted in these small soil pits where the roots have limited space to grow and absorb water, and also often in high traffic areas. So they experience a lot of compaction, litter, and contamination from road salt. Responsibility for planting these trees recently changed departments in the City of Toronto in 2022. So they went from being planted by in-house crews to being physically planted by landscape contractors. So this kind of presented a good opportunity to begin this survey with kind of a clean slate and get some information to adjust practices as the program develops. These hard surface trees are highly valuable assets. The cost to replace even one of these trees can be in the thousands of dollars. As you can see in this picture, it requires these large trucks to transport and plant the heavy trees, and sometimes even shutting entire lanes of busy city streets to get access to the tree pits. So our survey in the summer of 2023 assessed the approximately 250 trees in the first cohort planted under the new system in 2022. And this map here shows the distribution of different species planted throughout the city. As you can see, they cover a wide range of the city. Okay, and so a little bit about the planting process. So in this example, this is a tree pit with concrete panels covering part of the soil. So it requires this crane truck to lift these heavy concrete panels to expose the soil. Then a whole nother truck called a hydrovac gets moved in. And it's basically like a giant vacuum on wheels. And it sucks up all the old soil so that the old tree stump can be removed. And then the crane truck comes back in and lowers the heavy ball and burlap tree into place. It's backfilled with new clean soil. The concrete panels are replaced and the tree is usually mulched and watered. So as you can see, it's a pretty intensive process, and that's why it's so expensive. So the main objective of our project was to conduct an observational study of hard surface trees to identify factors affecting their establishment and health, such as species differences, soil salinity, tree pit type, pH, sunlight exposure, and mulch. And the goal was to kind of identify factors that could be adjusted for in tree maintenance and planting procedures so that we can help improve the survival and health of these trees. So we surveyed 249 out of the 252 trees planted in 2022. We missed 3 trees just because they weren't physically accessible for measurements. The main health and establishment indicators we measured were crown dieback, 2023 branch extension, and the average change in branch extension between 2022 and 2023. So crown dieback measures the amount of twigs in the outer portion of the crown that have lost leaves. And then branch extension basically measures how much the tree's branches grew each year. So you can actually just measure with a tape measure. You go from the tip of the branch, as you can see in this diagram, to the first annual bud scar, which is basically like a little line on the twig, and that's 1 year's growth. And then you can even go from that bud scar to the previous year's bud scar to measure the previous year's growth. And kind of comparing these growth rates with that change in branch extension gives you a good indication of how well the tree is establishing in its new site. If it's growing more in this year than the previous year, that's kind of a sign that it's establishing fairly well, so it can commit more resources towards branch growth. And then we also measured environmental factors that might be affecting these health indicators. So we measured soil electrical conductivity as a proxy for soil salinity, so basically the salt levels in the soil. So salt is highly conductive, so if your soil is conductive, as a good indication that there's a lot of salt in it. Though electrical conductivity can also be affected by other factors like heavy metal contamination, but salt is usually the main factor. We also looked at tree pit type because there's all kinds of different tree pits found throughout the city. We looked at soil pH, sunlight exposure. We measured with this sunlight tracking app, which is basically an app that uses your phone camera and shows you the trajectory of the sun through the sky from your location. And so what we did is, standing at the base of the tree, we counted the number of hours where there was a direct line of sight to the sun. And so that kind of stands in for the amount of sunlight hours the tree might receive. And then we also looked at the presence of mulch, whether the pits were fully covered in mulch or only partially covered or lacking mulch. So the statistical analysis of species difference was only conducted on the 216 trees from more commonly planted species. These commonly planted species were accolade elm, hackberry, honey locust, Kentucky coffee tree, and valley forage elm. The sample sizes for the less commonly planted species were too small to make meaningful species comparisons. And these species are more commonly planted because they're expected to perform better in harsh urban conditions. And they're also all species native to Southern Ontario, except for accolade elm, which is an Asian elm hybrid. So we used ANCOVA tests to test for differences in means, and ANCOVA models were used to model significant linear relationships between variables. A confidence interval of 95% was used, so p-values less than 0.05 indicate significance. So we found significant differences between species in terms of crown dieback and change in branch extension. It seems like accolade elm had the best performance overall, as it had the lowest crown dieback and the highest change in extension. Hackberry is a species that's kind of new to the hard surface planting roster. And unfortunately, we found that it had fairly high dieback, higher than the other commonly planted species. But at the same time, when hackberry did get established, it did fairly well and actually had the second highest change in extension. And then another interesting to note was that valley forage elm, which is an American elm hybrid, had much lower change in extension than the accolade elm, which is the Asian elm hybrid. We found a significant relationship between crown dieback and soil electrical conductivity. As you can see in this ANCOVA plot, there's a positive relationship. So as electrical conductivity increases, dieback increases, which is what we would expect because a lot of research has found that salt harms trees. And so in these ANCOVA plots, every point represents a tree, and then the species are differentiated by color. And to give you some background about this soil salinity data, this table is from the US Department of Agriculture Soil Health Guide, because farmers often measure their soil salinity because it can affect crop growth. And so based on this chart, levels from about 1.2 to 1.5 is kind of the threshold of the units are decisiemens per meter. And that's kind of the threshold. Anything higher than that, your soil is considered slightly saline. So I marked that threshold also on the ANCOVA plot with that dotted vertical line. And so the average electrical conductivity in the tree pits was about 1.2 decisiemens per meter. So right on that verge of being slightly saline soil. And measurements ranged from not saline at all to 15 decisiemens per meter, which you can see is considered very strongly saline. So it does seem like salt is affecting these trees. We categorized all the different sorts of pits you can find in the city into three broad categories. Those pits with concrete panels covering a portion of the soil, pits with a curb around the tree, and then these completely open tree pits. We didn't find any significant differences between these pit types in terms of crown dieback, change in branch extension, or electrical conductivity, but there were some small observable differences. It seems like the curb pits did the best overall. They had the lowest dieback, the highest change in extension, and the second lowest electrical conductivity. And we kind of expected them to have lower electrical conductivity because we think that the curb around the pit might actually help stop the salt from getting into the soil. Conversely, the open pits had the highest electrical conductivity because there's nothing there to stop the salt. But also surprisingly, the concrete panels had the lowest electrical conductivity, which is surprising because those concrete panels don't look like they would really prevent salt from getting into that middle open portion of soil, which is where we collected our samples from. But at the same time, they also had the highest dieback and the lowest change in extension. So it seems like the concrete panels don't really do the trees any favors. We found significant relationships between pH and change in extension and 2023 branch extension, but no significant relationship with dieback. So it seems like pH is more of an influence on tree growth rather than overall health, at least for these recently planted trees. And so it's a negative relationship. So as pH went up, it reduced tree growth, which is somewhat surprising because these commonly planted species are all expected to be tolerant of alkaline soils, but it seems like their tolerance has a limit and more alkalinity will reduce tree growth. And they seem to grow the best in that kind of neutral pH range around 7. We didn't find any significant relationships between the sunlight exposure and crown dieback or change in branch extension. But there was a slight significant relationship between sunlight and 2023 branch extension. As you can see from the slope, it's like almost horizontal. So, but slightly positive. So as sunlight goes up, there's slightly more branch growth, but it's not really that strong a relationship. And so we kind of found that overall, at least for these trees 1 year out from planting, sunlight doesn't have a major influence on their health or establishment. And then finally, we found significant differences between the fully mulched pits and the pits without full mulch coverage in terms of dieback, electrical conductivity, and pH. So the fully mulched pits had much lower dieback and also lower electrical conductivity, which we think might be because the mulch is either absorbing the salt or at least preventing it from reaching the soil. And then kind of surprisingly, the fully mulched pits had slightly higher pH, which we kind of expected to bring it to more towards neutral. But this could be because the pH of the material being used as mulch might be slightly alkaline. And then based on these results, we developed some recommendations for hard surface street tree management. The City of Toronto Urban Forestry can't really do much to prevent road salt use. We still need to keep our sidewalks and streets safe during the winter. Some cities have completely eradicated salt use and use alternatives like sand. So that's kind of more a broader, wide city decision. But what urban forestry can do is be strategic about their species selection. And they already do this, but these findings can kind of help inform their decision making. So planting hardier species like the accolade elm in the more difficult locations, like those open pits and concrete panel pits. And then conversely, planting the less tolerant species like hackberry, so we preserve street tree diversity, but planting them in the better sites like those curbed pits. But a kind of difficult question is knowing which sites are better or worse beyond just the differences in pit type. And so something that might help with that is using these rapid field-based site assessment tools like we used in our survey. So the electrical conductivity meter, pH probe, and sunlight exposure app. With those, city staff could quickly assess a planting site and then determine the appropriate species to put there. And then finally, mulch seemed to help reduce crown dieback. The trees get mulched when they're planted, but in some sites, it seems like the mulch kind of gets dissipated fairly quickly. So we'd recommend regular reapplication of a mulch, for example, biannually. And then we also have some recommendations for future research. So for one, continuing this sort of street tree survey, it'd be a good opportunity to continue following this planting cohort over multiple years so we can track changes in time and track things like establishment progress and survival rates. And then also if we surveyed another planting cohort, that would immediately double our sample size and maybe reveal more significant relationships. A limitation of our study is that we didn't look at drought stress, which is an important stressor for these hard surface trees. We didn't look at it because these recently planted trees get watered by the city during the summer. So it'd be kind of hard to accurately determine their drought stress. But an important question is when to cut off this watering, because it's fairly expensive, especially as more trees get planted. You can't keep watering all of them. And so a kind of open question is when is the right time to cut it off where you don't get excessive tree mortality which would cost more money in the long run to replace the trees. Another interesting line of research would be these species comparisons. These commonly planted species, there's fairly limited research about them, and most of the information you can find is from nursery websites. So it'd be interesting to kind of build on some of our findings from this field-based survey and answer questions like, why did accolade elm perform better? Was it more salt tolerant? Was it more drought tolerant? So I think like controlled experimental studies might be able to further explain those kind of differences. And then finally, biochar presents a potential future tool to help mitigate salt and pH contamination in hard surface trees. Recent research has found that, biochar is basically charcoal that is added to the soil. And recent research has found that biochar can help mitigate salt stress in plants. However, there's not really enough research yet to justify implementing this on a wide scale for all the hard surface trees. There's not enough research on the effects on trees. But luckily, the Thomas Lab at U of T is about to embark on a trial biochar application to hard surface tree pits in the city of Toronto, city of Edmonton, and Quebec City. And so this presents like an exciting future potential tool to help these trees. Thank you. Please go ahead and ask any questions.
I'm just getting the mic ready to.
Oh, okay, nice.
The audience question. Okay, thank you, Jaakko. Matey.
Hello. Thank you, Jaakko. Great presentation. I know you put a lot of hard work to collecting all the data and developing this protocol and your methods. We appreciate you presenting this data for us and allowing us to improve our methods and how we operate and success rate in the urban forest establishment of these most difficult sites, right? I find the accolade elm statistics about like being one of the most successful species, or it's a hybrid, to establish in these sites, and it raises a lot of questions in terms of, you know, how do we achieve biodiversity and resilience in the urban forest when we're limited to so few species and or cultivars or hybrids? Them are non-native, right? And a lot of have been overplanted throughout the past few decades, and poses a lot of different challenges in terms of creating that resilience, allowing for native biodiversity to thrive in this. So yes, my question to you is, how would you go about in such a setting in terms of promoting biodiversity, especially since we do have a lot of difficult sites we operate? Most of them are these open pits or concrete and so on, right? Where there are difficult situations.
Well, I think you guys in the city do a fairly good job considering the limitations, because yeah, there's not that many trees that can thrive in these conditions. But yeah, planting more diverse species that don't necessarily do as well in those better sites. And I know you've also suffered a big loss because ash is an important street tree, which is a native tree, and it can no longer be used because of the emerald ash borer. But I think like doing things like incorporating hackberry more is a good solution to that. And even though they didn't perform as well, you know, when they did establish, they did fairly well. And also it was interesting, we found here that I didn't include it in the results because the sample sizes were too small, but there's these cultivars of hackberry, and they seem to actually do better than the common hackberry. So they're the cultivars produced by the nursery for like increased strength and resilience. And so, for example, the hackberry magnifica, it was a very small sample, but it had only about 5% crown dieback. So maybe future research into those kind of things could be helpful to find more resilient cultivars of native species. And yeah, just being strategic and incorporating diversity where you can.
Thank you. I have a follow-up to that, and it's kind of related to the hackberry species or cultivars. Is there possibly a better time to establish these species in terms of allowing more time kind of get established prior to the plant?
Yeah, so actually, unfortunately, I didn't include it in the appendix, but we did also find a significant relationship between planting dates and dieback. Or I know, and dieback and growth. So the trees that were planted earlier in the season tended to do better. They had less dieback and higher growth rates. So yeah, it could a strategic move could be planting these species that struggle more earlier in the season, so they have more time to kind of get established and get watered and set them up for success.
Thank you very much. Great presentation.
Thank you. Now I'll open it up to the general audience. Any questions? Yes. Okay, well, will the people on Zoom hear if you just? Okay,
So, I was wondering if you look at, I guess, the quality of planting. So, like the installation itself, it was a little hard to tell from the photo, but it kind of looked like in the photo of how they planted the tree. It was still kind of encased in burlap, and I know that sometimes contractors, they kind of at time, they literally just put the tree straight from the nursery right in the ground, and it never established itself. I was wondering if you looked at that in your studies.
okay, thanks. So the question was if planting practices were examined at all as a variable in the study.
So no, they weren't explicitly examined because it's kind of hard to also even access that kind of information. So the trees are usually covered, the soil's covered in mulch and things. So it's hard to even kind of really see that. The reason they're planted in the burlap is kind of out of necessity. If you remove the burlap, the root ball will just fall apart, and the roots will kind of fall apart when you're planting it. So, but the burlap does decompose, and so eventually the roots can get out, ideally.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there are some other kind of research methods. We saw one where you can actually, for to test establishment, you can kind of wiggle the trunk around and measure how far it goes. But we were worried that might, that has the potential to harm the trees, and it's kind of a rough measurement. So yeah, that is an interesting thing, that looking at planting practices. Overall, though, like just from my observations, they were pretty consistent, like in terms of the depth they were planted at and things like that. And the city staff does supervise the contractors while they're planting them. So they do a pretty good job of being consistent.
Thanks. And we do have a comment from Matty on that.
So the photo that you're seeing is prior to the backfilling of the soil. City staff are present through every single planting to make sure that it is planted according to our specs. As you can see, a lot of excavation occurs in these pits. Like that's a 1.2 meter by 2.4 meter pit. And around the root ball, we tend to excavate to the depth of the root ball. And so the root ball can't be opened up until there is at least some partial backfilling that occurs. And at that point, we open up the top half of the root ball. If it were to be opened prior to that, then obviously you could have, I guess, a destabilization at root ball, right? So that's why it has to be backfilled at least partially before they open up the wires and the burlap. So we do open the burlap top half, but that's done after some backfilling so that there isn't that falling apart of the root ball.
Hey, thank you. Any other questions? Yes, Sally.
Yeah, are all the trees the same age that are planted, or are there different sort of establishment times in the nursery for these trees? And would that have any effect?
I didn't actually have that information, but I do believe they're all different ages, especially because some of these trees grow much faster than others. Like some are really slow growers, like the ginkgo. So it probably takes a lot longer for them to get to the right size. But they are all planted within a certain like caliper size range. So at least in terms of size, they're fairly consistent.
Do you think longer time in the nursery would be helpful to them?
I'm not sure. Well, it seemed like, yeah, I'm not too sure, to be honest. I mean, the ones that were planted earlier seem to do better, so. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, yes.
Good job, Jaakko. What I was kind of wondering what the context, like Toronto's not the only one with this problem in planting, and I wondered what other cities have found, and because they're going to have the same challenges, and so it's not a new problem, but you're bringing it to the city to how to make improvements. So the recommendations are great, but how does that fit in the bigger urban forest context?
Surprisingly, there's fairly few studies about specifically hard surface trees. Like there's been studies, lots of studies in other cities about urban trees, but they also look at like lawn trees and things like that. There was a recent study in Kyoto looking at the hard surface trees, and so they looked at kind of similar environmental factors that might be affecting them, including pruning intensity. But they were looking at all ages of trees, so this is kind of a novel study in looking at specifically the establishment phase of these hard surface trees. And I think some of these findings could translate to different cities, but of course, like the species and things might be different in different climate zones, but at least these issues of salt are definitely prevalent in all, northern cities that use road salt.
Thank you. And one more question.
You somehow knew that I had something to say. So you have, what did you see in these trees that would lead you to think about other kinds of stresses? I mean, people talk, of course, about the dog effect, which, looms over all of this work, but kind of physical damage. There are species that definitely have biotic kind of disease or insect kind of issues, or that kind of proximity to entrances of buildings or TTC stops or those kind of things is a good predictor probably of salt applications and so forth. So I guess just your sort of sense of what other predictors there might be out there that would be good to guide especially species selection in these sites.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that was kind of surprising is there was fairly little physical damage on the trees. We did record that. So fortunately, like vandalism stuff didn't seem to be a big impact on these trees. In terms of other things, yeah, dog urine is probably a big factor. I definitely noticed a lot of that sampling the soil. But it's a difficult one to do much about. Maybe biochar could have some influence on that, or mulch application to kind of block that. Other things we did record if we saw insect infestations and things like that, but there wasn't too much of that. Just like small things that really weren't affecting the health too much. We did look at things like planter area, like the size of the planters and things like that, but they actually didn't produce significant results. In terms of, we also looked at proximity to building entrances, and I think I have a slide about that. And surprisingly, actually, it wasn't a significant result, p-value greater than 0.05, but it was the trees further from building entrances actually seem to have higher electrical conductivity, which is somewhat surprising, but it's kind of hard to predict salt usage. It also depends on the contractor even, one building, they might put tons of salt out, the other might, not put as much. So that's why I think those field-based tools could be helpful for determining the quality of the site. Because then you could see, if this tree died here, you could sample the soil, see, oh, it was really, really high salt contamination. Maybe we put an accolade elm or a honey locust there, and it'll be more tolerant.
All right. Thank you.